Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? All right, we got a kind of a lackluster response, but I'll take it. Thank you for participating and joining today in our talk on doing more with MobileIron Sentry using control, access, per app, VPN, and app tunneling. That is a mouthful. So a little background about me before we kind of get into this, this session on Sentry. Is one of my responsibilities at MobileIron is to work with organizations and executives and IT people on trying to understand how to enable their users and their business process using mobile, right? So they have a really good user experience. This way they get the data that they need to get to be more productive while doing it securely. And Sentry is really the way to do that. I do a bunch of other different things at MobileIron, but my day-to-day responsibilities really do involve that particular role. Now, we're going to cover really quickly, we're going to go over what Sentry is, so if somebody's not really familiar with Sentry. We're going to talk about how you could secure your apps, some advanced security, and this stuff gets pretty advanced, and this presentation can get a bit technical, but I really want to be able to provide you more of kind of like a high-level overview of what you can do with Sentry, but there are going to be certain terms that we use, and I will go over the terminologies just so it's not completely foreign and you don't feel like you're keeping up with the material, and then some next steps. So first, with the Sentry overview, who here is not using Sentry currently, just by raising your hand really high so I can see it, in your environment? So we have one man, nope, that's not using Sentry in their environment. Are you currently a MobileIron customer? That's a really good reason not to use Sentry. In fact, nobody else has any other reason aside from that. Thank you for your honesty. So everybody else is using Sentry. Now, if you're using Sentry only for email, raise your hand high in the sky. Only email. Sir, that's not that high. Remember, you got to participate or otherwise I call you out. So I got 4 here, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now everybody else is using Sentry with App Connect or tunneling. That's awesome. That's actually a lot more than I was anticipating. That's great. If you're only using Sentry for email, we're going to cover those other aspects of what it can do. So MobileIron Sentry overview. Think of Sentry very simply as a mobile traffic cop or a firewall. The user wants to gain access to certain kinds of resources in your infrastructure. Email is one. Maybe you have an intranet. Maybe you have, more than likely you do have an intranet. Maybe you have SharePoint and you want them to be able to get documents. Maybe you want them to use like access to CIF shares so they can get files in their home directory, or some other WebDAV enabled app like Box. So Sentry first validates whether or not that user's device is allowed into your network by doing some authentication, and then it delivers them to that resource as long as their device meets the security posture level that you have configured in core. That's the easiest way I can explain Sentry, because it gets a lot deeper from there, but you guys all get that, right? Awesome. Now there's 2 kinds of Sentries. You have the integrated Sentry, which was built specifically to work with things like Office 365 in order to make sure that your users who are going to get access to email through Office 365 can or cannot. That's all it does. Standalone Sentry does everything else that we've been talking about. It does what the integrated does and so much more. One of the things that Sentry can also be configured to do is Kerberos single sign-on. Who is using Kerberos today? Big hand in the sky. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 10 people, which is about a third of you. That's actually not too bad. Kerberos is one of those things, I think it was properly named because it's the guardian of Hades. It's this 3-headed dog. It's also very intimidating to a lot of IT and security people because they kind of know what it does, but they kind of not know how to get it to do what it's supposed to do the right way. So it becomes this daunting, almost impossible task to deploy in their environment. So I think it was aptly named Kerberos. But the single sign-on portion of it is the Sentry is able to then take that ticket granted to that user and cache it for a little while. And that's specifically more for like iOS. And I understand you can use it with other platforms, but specifically with iOS, you can have that user go, get that, the TGT will give them the ticket, and then they can access those resources, even if they put their phone to sleep and they come back on. And that was really kind of the point behind it. So it's not all that extra overhead and kind of beating down on your TGT or your KDC. Other things, a part of like features or components of Sentry would be like App Connect. App Connect really means it's a MobileIron wrapper around an app, whether you guys built it or had a third party build it for you, or if it's from somebody in our ecosystem, which we have the partners here today at the conference. But App Connect has four main real values, and I'll go into them a little deeper, but at a high level, it's providing containerization, selective wipe, secure transmission or tunneling of that data or the content from the resource, as well as configuration. And I'll get into those details soon. App tunnel versus tunnel. This is, to me, like when I joined MobileIron a couple years ago, it was probably one of the more confusing parts of using the Sentry. You got App Connect and App Tunnel, and what do they all mean? Well, app tunneling is a feature of App Connect. So that's the secure transport, data in motion, right? Secure transport. And it does some other things. Tunnel is our way to kind of like, so if you're familiar with the per app VPNs that came out with iOS 7, a way to make those APIs kind of kick off, we had to build some like helper code. And I just think of tunnel as that. So compared to maybe the traditional VPN that would be installed on the mobile device, and the user goes in and they tap the VPN and they might put in a username and password, they might do a duo push, they might grab their key fob, whatever you guys are configured to do, and then they have access to whatever resource you want to give them from their mobile device. The security concern about that is now that entire device has access to your entire network or whatever you have configured on your VPN. So if they're going to run Telnet or SSH, or maybe they're going to use some file sharing app that's really not approved, and they have it and they're pulling down files that are not containerized, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So Tunnel solves that problem because as long as that app was built using those per app VPN APIs, one tap and all the heavy lifting is done behind the scenes by MobileIron, gets that user into whatever they want to use. Jabber, I think, is a great example of that. So our ecosystem is another big part of Sentry because when we have organizations like, I think Captors here today, or like Box or whomever, there are a bunch of our technology partners who took our wrapper and wrapped up their app, and they either published it in the public app store, so you could just download it, and as long as you have a Sentry and you're using MobileIron, you can configure it and go. Or they get it to you however way they want, like a web link or an email or whatever. But that really kind of enables their app to work with your environment through MobileIron. Simple way to explain it. And the best place to find out who's a partner or a member of that ecosystem is going to marketplace.mobileiron.com. I got a slide on that later, but I just thought I'd throw that out a couple times to make sure it sticks. So definitely visit our ecosystem partners today. Kind of jumping down to Kerberos constrained delegation. That's another part of that whole intimidating IT with the three-headed dog thing. To me, while it's a bit of heavy lifting on the back end, it really elevates that user experience, or UX. You might hear me just say UX a couple more times, so now you know what it means. But KCD solves some very interesting problems that were introduced because of mobile. For example, you start with email. You're using pass-through authentication or basic authentication. The user changes their password in Active Directory. I'm going to ask you, you guys are going to shake your head when you hear this. They change their password in Active Directory, then their phone tries to connect, but they didn't update the password on their phone. And then it tries again, and it's failing. And then after whatever your threshold of bad logins is, now they can't get to stuff on the network, their email on their desktop or laptop breaks, and they're frustrated. They call support and yell at you because it's your fault that you're not using Kerberos. Really, that's kind of a very common problem because it's the user who didn't change the password, but it's your fault because you're on the other end of that phone. So Kerberos, while about a third of you are using it, solves this problem. It's going to elevate that UX because from their perspective, what are they used to, when it comes to using mobile apps, right? You click it and it works. It just works. With Kerberos, they open up mail, and as long as that mail server is Kerberized, it just works. And any other kind of apps, whether it's a web at work on your internal web apps, or if it's SharePoint with Docs at work, it's a great UX. So it solves that problem. Users are happy. You don't have inbound angry support calls, and you kind of move that mobile journey a lot closer to where you want it to go. Kerberos proxy, I don't want to talk about too much, but it's essentially built because the way the Windows mobile platform works, it doesn't like an intermediary CA. So with Kerberos, core is that intermediary to get the certificates, but the Windows platform doesn't like it. So it's essentially just like another proxy back in, and that's kind of what it's doing. It's a bit complex to stand up. We don't recommend that you do it on your own, but it does solve that problem. So if you're thinking of using Kerberized apps with Windows, you need a Kerberos proxy. So here's the use cases for the standalone Sentry specifically. When it comes to email and applications, we'll just kind of go through these in a little bit more depth. So we talked about like active sync associations. So for people who are using mail only with Sentry, do you have it enabled or that preference to block unregistered devices? Because if you're not, I hope you have a good reason, because the users are then able to just grab any other mobile device and point it to the Sentry to start getting mail. So they're unregistered devices that have access to your mail. All right, so what? Well, what if there's a sensitive document that they pull down and that lands on the mobile device? There was a bug in iOS 7 where the attachments were not encrypted, but if you were using our attachment control, which is right here, they would have been encrypted and that would not have been an issue for you. So, mistakes happen and things go on, but having these different kinds of countermeasures gives you, I guess, the term that people like to use is defense in depth. I don't. I actually like to use the term of kind of like casting a net and making those holes smaller and smaller. The more nets you cast, the tinier the holes are, and some of them actually get covered up. So if you're going to use things like the Sentry for email, you can block those devices. It's great if there's a change, like for example, somebody wants to get a new phone. Well, they can't just take that new phone and point it to the Sentry to get mail. They got to enroll it, specifically with BYOD. It works with native mail and App Connect enabled email. So we do have an app called Email Plus, which is App Connect enabled, and you can use that for containerizing mail. And depending on the version of Android or iOS, determines whether or not there's a PIM and other contact information that's stored in there. But it has those features of selective wipe and containerizing or kind of walling off mail. And it keeps it encrypted at rest. Native mail, one of the cool things about App Connect enabled apps, it kind of falls into the other side with the DLP, is you can control if an app is able to share data with other apps. So open-in controls and things like that, or copy and paste. And you have the option to either allow all apps, not much security there, but you might have a good reason for that. Only App Connect enabled apps, which I think is pretty cool. So any App Connect enabled app is able to share data with another, or you can whitelist it. And if you whitelist it, that means if you're using native mail with your users instead of like an ACE version or App Connect enabled, you can whitelist that one app. You are introducing a certain level of risk, and that really depends on what your risk appetite is at your organization, but you can absolutely do that. Certificate-based authentication, that's really between the device and the Sentry, and I got some nice diagrams. Usually also another thing when people hear certificates, they're kind of their spine tightens, their gut hurts, and it's usually not the most pleasant experience for most people, but don't worry, it'll be a nice friendly experience today. We talked about SSO, we talked about attachment control. So Web at Work and Docs at Work, really those are the MobileIron App Connect apps you really want to go to. Why? Well, if you're encrypting your email attachments, how do you decrypt it so the user can use it? You would do that with Docs at Work. Docs at Work not only provides that container and everything else that we've been talking about, but it also has the ability to edit those attachments. If it's a PDF, they can annotate that attachment and then even send it back to someone else, because you can set that control up whether or not they can send it on and share within those different types of apps. So here's like a nice, easy paradigm. A user receives an email, it's encrypted, they go to open it, it launches with Docs at Work. Docs at Work, they look at the doc and go, you know, I got another version of that, but it's actually on SharePoint. Let me go get that new version. So they go to the content site in Docs at Work, they go to that SharePoint site, which they have authorization to do because of your ACLs that you've configured. They get that document, they pull it down to Docs at Work, it's stored in the container, they go to edit it, it's launched with Polaris Office, it's in there, they make some edits, they save it, and now they want to do an open in and send it to the email where it gets encrypted at the client and it's sent off to the recipient, where the recipient doesn't see the encryption, it's only between the mobile device and Sentry, so any other kind of email scrubbing type of tools you have in the middle can still do their job. And then that recipient gets the proper document. Sounds too good to be true, right? But I do that on a regular basis at MobileIron. Very simple to do with all this other technology built out. Third-party apps. So I had a potential customer, I think they became a customer. Yeah, they were a customer that had this requirement. So when I joined MobileIron 2 years ago, sorry, I went on a little bit tangent. When I joined MobileIron 2 years ago, I was on the phone with somebody, and I think they were an insurance company, and they had the requirement of, we got people going out and they're doing investigations, they're taking pictures, the picture lands on the device in the camera roll, but we need a way to send that off to the back end and never have it touch the camera roll, because we don't ever want to know what's going on. What do you guys have? MobileIron, we don't have that. All right, any of your ecosystem partners? Let me check, we have a spreadsheet. Sorry, nobody's in there that does that. So what are we supposed to do? That was their response. You got to go build it yourself. And they're like, I don't think we want to do that. Fortunately, there's a company formerly known as InkScreen, now they're called Capture. They have that kind of an app, and they're a MobileIron ecosystem partner. So that problem that existed some time ago is solved today, which I think is really exciting because it's not something that anybody needs to wait for anymore, it's there. So when you want to do something with something if you have a business problem that needs to be solved, rather than trying to figure out what the best solution is and then coming to MobileIron and saying, hey, how do we make this work with this tech that we bought? They might not be a partner. You really want to do something like go to, I thought it'd be the next slide, but no, it's not the next slide. I was going to show you the picture of Marketplace. I think it's the slide after the diagrams. But you want to go to Marketplace and you want to type in some keyword searches, web filtering or photos or something like that. Find the app and then go from there. Or just call your account team. Say, hey, look, here's a problem we're trying to solve. What does MobileIron recommend? And that's what that company did. It just, unfortunately, at that time, there's no solution, but today there is. But that's kind of the point of that whole story. Now, how does this all kind of stick together? And this is where it's going to get a little bit more technical, just to kind of, I'm assuming mostly everybody here is technical. So kind of in our minds, we want to see how the dots are connected. So this way, when we need to communicate it with somebody, we can kind of visualize it and explain it much more succinctly versus, I don't know, this guy on stage said that sounded, this really was like good and we need to do it, so let's get it and call the account team. So that doesn't always work with a good project plan or getting, executive justification. So for email specifically, on the mobile device, so the orange line obviously means like App Connect. To be clear, I mean, the diagram's a little misleading. App Connect does not create like one giant container or sandbox. Every app is in its own container. So that orange line, it's misleading, but it's really to identify all the apps that are using App Connect. So here with email, it's got that little padlock down there. So email, hang on a second, I got technology to help me with this. So email is here. It goes through the Sentry. Let's just assume you're not encrypting it or anything. It passes through the Sentry after some certificate-based authentication, and then it goes there to whatever your MTA is. The users get mail, the users send mail. When it comes to docs and content, let's just say this is like Docs at Work. They launch it, it goes through the Sentry again with the same certificate-based authentication, and then they go back to whatever your enterprise application is, and in this example, it's SharePoint. Pretty simple, right? It's very linear, but it can get actually a little bit hairier with some other technology introduced. But that, again, is like high level how it works. When you talk about the integrated Sentry, different scenario. Mail does not go through your DMZ, it's in the cloud. So the integrated Sentry is really just a bunch of PowerShell commands running on a Windows server just to, again, validate the account state information. That's it. Simple and straightforward. Okay. I think that's pretty clear. Let's move on to how we can secure these apps a little further now that you kind of get the terms. And I said ACE earlier, so App Connect enabled, little e. It's just an interesting way that we did that. And then we're going to talk about tunneling and per app VPN. So let's start with App Connect. So I mentioned before, right, the 4 main things you get with an App Connect enabled app is your containerization, your secure transport, which is your app tunnel, the control, which comes from the SDK, so whether it's going to be like copy and paste control or some like DLP settings, and then the compliance, so the selective wipe and other third-party apps. While secure mobile, while preserving the user experience, the users are going to do what they want, and if they get an app that they want to use and it's really not that secure, if you use something that's App Connect enabled from the ecosystem, you have the compliance. So you guys are familiar with the terms like data at rest, data at use, data in motion, and that's where the containerization comes in. It comes in with the data at rest and data in use. So in order for docs at work to edit a doc, it's got to be pulled down into the container. So when it's local to that device, then the user can edit it and in some cases upload it back to SharePoint or CIFS, which is really nice because if they've got like that big iPad Professional, it's like giant, the thing is massive. They're going to want to do more on that. And I don't know if you guys are introducing them into your environment yet, but if they're going to start to abandon their laptops, you've got to come up with a way to give them what I just described, a way to edit documents. And then there's data separation. So if you are either working for like a government or in Europe, there's some very strict data separation privacy laws, and you got to adhere to them. Using the containerization helps you comply with that. Secure transport, we talked about how App Tunnel works, which really end-to-end a little bit more. And I got a diagram for this, is just when the device connects to the resource, when the user launches that app, behind the scenes, there is a certificate that's used to authenticate that user and that device to Sentry. Before anything else happens, that's the first connection and the first step. And of course, it's using open standards or open protocols like TLS. And what's really cool is we added in, within the way you can manage core, is the which version of TLS. Like you can make it a bit more strict, so it's all been exposed in the web UI. So if you want to make, like you're only using like TLS 1.1 or 1.2, you can do that. The SDK, I don't know if I made this clear or not, but I'll say it again if I did say it once. You can use the SDK to wrap your own apps, which I speak with a lot of different organizations where they're developing their own apps and they want that ability to give them to the users. And even if it's just to give it to them so it's containerized, they may never ever be data in there, but they don't want to take a chance. So they wrap them up. They know the communication's going through Sentry. They can see it in the core or even in the cloud. You can see when the tunneling's happening, and they know that they're using the apps and they're using them securely. Configuration is pretty much a given, and I think we talked about those other items. So here's the marketplace screenshot that I was looking for before. It's just marketplace.mobileiron.com. Even if you don't have a project now, I encourage you to go there, get familiar. You'll see some stuff in there. So for example, like right here, Cisco ICE. I worked on a project with a customer where they had a concern about these. Well, they already had mobile devices going onto a guest network, and they wanted to be able to give them internal access. But unless the device for sure was enrolled in MobileIron, they only had access to the guest network. So using ICE, they were able to then know which devices were already enrolled in MobileIron, and if they were, you're free to go. If not, they got sent to the registration page. Solves a nice problem, because those rogue devices, everybody's plagued with. So go in here, type in like keywords, web filtering or what have you, and more than likely we're already a partner with one of the companies that you already have in your network. Tunneling. So this is what it looks like. I'll pass on that. So we're going to do device certificate authentication with server pass-through. So I talked about device certificate authentication already. Server pass-through is what's happening between the Sentry and your resource. So whether it's going to be using basic authentication or NTLM or Kerberos certificate or ticket. So the first step is the user, well, that went fast. The user launches the app, and they connect to Sentry, which is a part of the configuration. It tells the app which Sentry to use. Sentry says, okay, wait a second. You got a cert? The app or the device says, yep, here's my certificate. Sentry double checks that with Core and says, yep, you got the right cert, or actually has a copy of it stored. Then it will, which is missing in here is the Core. It'll then talk to the Core and say, hey, Core, is this device cool? Is this device not jailbroken or rooted, or do they have apps that you're allowing? Is there anything wrong with it? Did the user remove the passcode? And if everything is fine, if it's all copacetic with that device, then the Sentry says, sure, you can go. And then you can see the certificate was removed, or the ribbon was removed from that user icon. The credentials are sent off to AD. AD says, yep, these are good. Talks to the application server. By the way, this guy is asking for some information. Give it to them. It sends the content through the Sentry and then delivers it to the mobile device. Little more simplified than the really low-level technical stuff that's going on, but you kind of get like how it's a bit more complex than the previous slides. So the pass-through is just really basic authentication. The user is going to be prompted to enter credentials. Let's look at the same example using Kerberos. So with Kerberos, same certificate-based authentication happens at the Sentry, but that certificate is also going to be forwarded through same communications with the Core. I'm just going to bypass that from now on. The certificate is then presented to the Kerberos KCD. A step that is missing is the KCD goes to the application server and says, hey, we're going to grant a ticket for this device. So that step got omitted. Apologize about that. There's the ticket to access the application. And then Sentry redirects the connection for that user to the resource. The user experience, my personal feeling, is phenomenal. It goes back to what I was saying before. It just works. They tap Web at Work. Web at Work and MobileIron technology, as well as other technology on the back end, do their thing, and the user gets a web page. Just as if they were going on the internet and they don't have to authenticate. But behind the scenes, all that authentication is happening. Where do you see like real value? If you're using SharePoint and you have, say, your landing page for SharePoint is being fed with a lot of different content sites, if the user has to go in and authenticate like a dozen times to just get that page to render, they're not going to want to use Web at Work. And that's really not what you want to do. You don't want to spend a lot of time putting together some tech and deploying it, and the users go, that's a pain in the neck, I don't want it. Security is getting in the way of me being productive. So with Kerberos, as long as those web apps are Kerberized, tap an icon, and everything happens behind the scenes, and it just works. Same thing is true for Docs at Work. Oh, yeah, the content gets delivered, and there it is. Now, this is a little bit more of some of the advanced security. So I'll go over the use cases in a little bit, but we also have some other technology called a trusted front end. And just going forward, I'll call it a TFE. Just it's easier, it's less of a tongue twister for me. So with the TFE, it can either run on an F5 or a CentOS box, which is a Linux distribution, with Apache. Okay, now you kind of understand what the technology is, but there's a lot of effort to set that up and to get it working. So we're going to avoid that for now. But with the TFE in front of the Sentry, the way the communication looks is the mobile device talks to the TFE, the device is authenticating to the TFE. Before it was on the Sentry, now it's on the TFE. The TFE and the Sentry, there's a certificate exchange that's manually happening between the two. So that's why it's a trusted front end. And you configure your Sentry to use the trusted front end. You might see something in there that says identity cert, group cert, trusted front end, and you look at that and you go, I don't know what that is, and I want this to work, so I'm not going to pick something that I don't understand, right? So now you kind of know what that trusted front end is, and until you have one of these boxes, obviously it won't work. but the Sentry has that certificate and knows the trusted front end through that. So that's how they're authenticating. So there's still authentication going on between those two devices. Now the connection is passed through to Active Directory. There probably shouldn't be a little ribbon on that icon, but there's a username and password being presented because it's a server pass-through example. It goes to SharePoint. I got somebody asking for resources. SharePoint says, fine, I know who they are, you trust them, and then it delivers the content to the mobile device. Pretty straightforward once it's explained to you. What if you introduce Kerberos? Things get a little bit more interesting. Same authentication with the TFE, same pass-through, those guys know one another. Sentry then goes to Kerberos, the KCD, and say, all right, we got a user cert, I need a ticket. It's supposed to say to SharePoint, fine, we got a resource. SharePoint says, fine, here's the ticket. Then the ticket goes to the Sentry to share, and then Sentry redirects it to the resource, which then eventually delivers the content to the user. So little extra couple steps, but that's a part of how Kerberos works. But again, the experience is no password prompts and no issues with email getting locked out because the user changed their password on the network, but not on their mobile device. Now, James, this is your cue. So I'm going to introduce James Saturnio. He is one of our highly, I guess, experienced, and he's very intelligent, and he knows tunnel very, very well. I do have another mic for you, but if you want to use that one,
how about if
come
I
on
stand
up.
right here?
Oh, you got to be up here.
Okay.
For the POV. But he's going to talk to you a bit about how tunneling works, because he's a real expert in this area.
Actually, how many of you folks are actually using MobileIron Tunnel? Okay, so the way it works, actually.
You want to, here, take the right button.
Okay, so for MobileIron Tunnel, for all three platforms, actually device cert is the only authentication method that's supported currently. So what you have is an iOS, an Android, or a Windows device to the left there, and it's going to establish a secure VPN tunnel to our Sentry. In this particular case, again, we're using certificate as the authentication method. And then the authentication part between the Sentry and to an authentication service like Active Directory will take place. And the domain controller or the Active Directory would actually do an RPC session to the SharePoint resource. And then the SharePoint or whatever backend resource is going to go ahead and forward the desired resource back to the mobile device. Okay, so for Kerberos, well, actually, Tunnel doesn't support Kerberos SSO at this particular point. Okay, you want to talk through this one, or? Okay. Yeah, actually, this slide is actually Kerberos is not supported as a server authentication for Tunnel. It's only certificate authentication at this point. So let's bypass this. Okay. Sorry, apologize for slide deck here. Okay, this is actually my slide here. This is actually my slide, and I apologize because it's a little difficult to actually follow, but this basically shows the differences with all the different MobileIron tunnel technologies. What you have to the left is iOS, and then I also threw in Windows Phone 8.1 because there are still some deployments out there that still have Windows Phone 8.1. Next column is Windows 10, and then lastly it's Android for Work. We have a MobileIron tunnel for each one of these platforms, and these basically this table just shows the differences. The key takeaways here are, first off, self-activation. In iOS, you have to activate Tunnel as soon as you download it onto the mobile device. Windows Phone, Windows 10, it's self-activating as soon as you download it onto the mobile device. Android for Work, it's a manual activation. The other takeaway here, aside from the fact that for iOS currently, the iteration for MobileIron Tunnel for iOS, it only still supports TCP, no UDP support yet, but all the other tunnel technologies support both TCP and UDP streams. Another consideration here is the actual triggering of that tunnel. Again, for Windows Phone, Windows 10, it can be app triggered. For Windows Phone 8.1, it can also be IP address based triggered. And but for Windows 10, it's not quite there yet. It's only app triggered at this particular point. IP based triggering is coming, and at some point, domain based triggering will be supported also. And really, the key takeaway again for this is there are differences, but there are also very similar capabilities of all these different tunneling technologies, and the look and feel is actually very similar amongst all of these MobileIron Tunnel VPN technologies.
Thank you very much, James. We appreciate your time today. Thanks for providing the additional information. So let's look at advanced security. And by advanced security, what I'm really talking about is the trusted front end, or the TFE. So we're going to get a little deeper into that. Not too deep. I do want to preface this whole section with what are the use cases behind the TFE? It sounds like a good idea to have a proxy in front of your Sentry. Remember, your Sentry, and this is the standalone Sentry, is a Linux-based appliance. But some organizations still have that mandate of putting the Sentry or any device that's communicating with the internet, there's got to be a proxy in between. And it makes sense. You want to have a connection, terminate a connection, and then start a new connection. So the use cases are really kind of here in these brackets. I mentioned the first one. The second one, actually, yeah, the first one is all traffic has to be routed through a proxy, or the other one is you don't want the Sentry in your DMZ. And I've worked with some organizations now, they didn't want the Sentry in the DMZ, but then they had another, so this is the third bullet item, they had a different use case that came up. They told me hundreds of web apps that they want to go through the Sentry. So you imagine if that Sentry was in the DMZ and they had to configure all those firewall rules. They didn't want to do it, and I don't blame them for not wanting to do it. So at that point, it makes a lot of sense to have the Sentry in their corporate network. Okay, so it's right next to those apps. It's no firewall issues in the middle, no extra work, but you really don't want that connection coming from the internet all the way down through your DMZ into your internal network. So that's another really good use case for the TFE. It kind of gets shimmed right there in between the device and the Sentry. Now, before you walk away from this and say, you know what I'm going to do when I go back to my office on Monday? I'm going to go build me a trusted front end. Don't do it. Not that we don't think you're technically capable. There's just a lot of other components on how Sentry works that you might not understand, and you're going to really get a lot of agita trying to figure it all out and spend a lot of time doing something that we could do for you, that we know how to do and make it really successful, versus you spinning those cycles where you could have been doing something else to help your organization. So please definitely make sure that you're engaging MobileIron professional services. Even if you talk to your account team and there's an SE that says, or sales engineer that says, yeah, I could do it for you, or here's the document, give it a try on your own, please heed my warning. I've seen the different use cases. I've seen issues where people try to do it on their own. They can't get it to work, and then they're frustrated, and now they've made promises internally that they can't deliver on. We don't want you in that situation. So again, heed my warning. Why? Well, I'll show you why in a bit. So there's a trusted front end. Again, it's F5 based, so we have documentation and stuff like that on how to set it up with an F5. We have some documentation on how to do it with Apache, but things change, and those documents do get outdated, and that's some of the things that I've run into where somebody's using a document from 2014 and things are not jiving because there's been some changes with underlying MobileIron technology. So the mobile device, we kind of saw this before, it's going to connect to the trusted front end, it's going to authenticate using a certificate, and then it's going to hand off that connection over to the Sentry. So I really kind of like think of it as like first connection, second connection. So this is the first connection between the device and the trusted front end, and this is the second connection. And you've got to configure each of those, and you really kind of step through it to make sure it's working properly. When I say you, I'm talking about like you as anyone in the third person, not you specifically. And then once the Sentry, I jumped ahead a little. Once the Sentry trusts or validates a certificate from the TFE, then it tells the TFE, okay, I'm going to give you whatever the resource is that it's asking for. And you guys understand that now because we already covered that. But maybe your core is in the DMZ and your Sentry is in the internal network. So there's your core, there's your DMZ. So you could still have the core talk through the TFE to reach the Sentry and vice versa, which is actually pretty cool. Not the easiest thing in the world to set up, but it's pretty cool. You guys gonna take a picture? I'll wait another second. All right, cool, awesome. Here's the build steps. I oversimplified it in this. It's 6 bullets, but there's a lot of sub-bullets. Just explaining at high level so you guys understand the undertaking that's involved is first you gotta build a CentOS box and install Apache with mod SSL. Kind of left that out. That's the sub-modules. Then you need to configure everything on that box for networking and firewall, as well as decide whether or not you want SE Linux on or off. Most people say, if you're not familiar with SE Linux, it's just like security enhanced Linux. It's a much more lockdown or protected version of Linux. And the way to, one of the things is to allow certain services that are like non-standard services, which is what Core does to talk to Sentry. You've got to use a command called SE manage. And not a lot of people want to do that. It's just more things you need to do on the box. You could do it, it's not that big of a deal, but it's like creating more and more firewall rules so that the kernel can then use those services. So you got to set all that up. And you got to tell Apache to be a reverse proxy. And then you got to tell, right there, then you got to tell which SSL settings you want to use, right? You really are using TLS, but you know, low, medium, high security, all those cipher suites, you want to turn some of them off, so you got to go in there in the conf file and change that. Then you got to generate this digital certificates using OpenSSL. Quick polling, who's done that before? Use OpenSSL? Yeah, a few people. Was it fun? I'm all getting, no. I don't mind doing it, but it's a lot of very like non-user friendly commands. You know, and it's easy to make mistakes and generate certificates incorrectly, and then you got to do it all over again. So you got to go through that pain again. But you got to generate the certs, and that's for authentication between the proxy and the Sentry, and then also, and it says, if applicable, between the mobile devices and the proxy, because you can have the trusted front end really kind of be in a pass-through mode, but in my personal opinion, that doesn't seem to make sense. You want to have the devices authenticating to the TFE, and then just let the Sentry and the TFE authenticate with one another as well. Now already I'm really tired from just reading that to you, but there's still more to do. Then you've got to install those certificates into Apache, and then you also have to add them to the Sentry, and then you configure Exchange and App Tunnel, and you got to do all the other settings that you normally do to get it all to work, and just really kind of hope it works. So you got to turn on a lot of logs, you got to check for errors, figure out the errors, why is this not working, firewall, certificates not generated properly, services are not responding. It's a lot of time and effort. Again, please engage MobileIron if you decide to do this. That was the whole kind of way to kind of dissuade you from wanting to do this on your own. And some of you might be like, hey, that sounds like a fun weekend project. Okay. So where do we go from here? Now that you guys understand how you can enable your users and maybe solve some business problems with a Sentry using Tunnel or App Connect, like the per app VPN, trusted front end, if you need to have that proxy in between, or you're going to have a lot of apps you want to use with your Sentry, putting that Sentry in your internal network, we could solve those problems for you. And that was just kind of the highlight there. But you got to really think about when you do your project. The way I like to do my projects is I like to define, what does success look like? Here's all the things we want, versus let's start doing stuff and eventually we'll get there. Well, with mobile, that may happen, but if it's a really long project life cycle, let's say 12 months, that's mostly not going to happen. So you define what you want success to look like, and then you put every milestone and task kind of going backwards along with a duration. So you know that if your first mission is to prevent unregistered devices from enrolling into MobileIron, that's a milestone, that's success. Define when you can do that. Then you want to stand up another Sentry. MobileIron recommends that you have one Sentry for mail and one for App Connect. So when you stand up that second Sentry and you start to define what's going to go through, I always recommend start with Web at Work. It's really easy to get that going. And now that you got your users using Web at Work, they're going further on this mobile journey. They're getting closer to what success looks like for you. If success is Web at Work, Docs at Work, Tunnel, etc., doing it all at once and rolling it out, it's not going to be pretty. So then you start to keep building on that. Then include Docs at Work. Then you go to Tunnel, and before you know it, and as things change, because they will change in mobile, you can easily pivot. When Android for Work was introduced, that changed a lot of things for a lot of people, and they had to make some new decisions on what their mobile journey is going to look like. So that's at least the final advice I can impart on you. I hope you folks enjoyed this session. Now it's time for questions. If